All right, well, thanks for giving me last week off. Jessica and I were in DC at a friend's wedding. So it's been a couple of weeks since we were last having this discussion. Anybody remember anything from 2 weeks ago? What we're talking about at all?
Church history.
Church history. All right, so far so good. Anything else?
They like to talk about theology.
As they were sorting it out?
Yeah, they were sorting it out,
As they made it
figuring
up.
it out.
Yeah.
They like talking.
I think we got to the 3rd century. Did we get to Constantine?
Yeah,
to
we
that?
got,
Okay.
we got to the fall of Rome.
All right.
Uh, So my overall scheme, a couple weeks ago, we kind of went up from the very beginnings to Augustine, or Augustine now everyone's saying. It feels weird to me. Because when I was in college, it's like, it's not Augustine, it's Augustine. And now the people in college are saying Augustine. Do I go with it, or I just become that old guy? I don't know. So, we talked about, the very beginnings of the church, kind of the radical, novel innovations of Christianity that were unique to religion. We had the Church of the Apostles that kind of spread out. A lot of them went to different places like Spain, case of James, allegedly, or Thomas in regards to India and further on. And at the early phases, the church is mostly Eastern, meaning it's east of the Levant. There were, this development of theology. People would ask questions. We're dealing with Greek philosophy, which is how we thought then, and trying to develop theology that fit into the construct of how we viewed the world. Once Constantine made Christianity the state religion, now we could all come up for air and talk to each other in the open without fear. And then we sort of started to realize our beliefs weren't all the same, that we had different collections of scripture. So there was a big process to try to pull that together, because guys just can't let something be in disorder. We've got to bring order to it. We can't let it live in tension. We started to talk a little bit about the desert fathers and mothers who started just move into the desert and start monasticism. If you ever go to Turkey, go to Cappadocia, see the caves there. They're quite fascinating, these early monasteries. And then we talked about the development of Christianity in places like Ethiopia and Armenia, who were also, like Constantine, had the church kind of wedded into the court. I'm gonna skip a bunch of that stuff. And then we kind of got to this discussion of Rome just kind of decaying away a little bit. They were getting pressured by Germanic tribes, which were Arian. And if you remember, one of those heresies was, the nature of Jesus. And I'm going to simplify this too much, but the basic idea is that Jesus came into his knowledge of himself and his role as the Savior, as opposed to being, from God. And a lot of the barbarians that were taking over Rome in the West were Arians, Visigoths, all that kind of stuff. And finally, I think it's Alaric, takes Rome, and then the Western Roman Empire is defunct. It's now been taken over from Spain to North Africa to Central Europe, by Goths. And then the East is still under the sway, Christendom is under the sway of Orthodox Christians. And that's where we were. All right, so let's dig into the Middle Ages. Fair question is, what is it in the middle of? So we had the beginning of this being kind of the fall of Western Rome. What might be the other bookend?
Well, the Renaissance.
Yep.
Yeah.
And things that spawn the Renaissance would be, all of a sudden we're flush with money and gold because we've been stealing it from all over the world. And we've got the resources. And we've also got after the fall of Constantinople, but before that also with the Crusades, there was a recovery of a lot of knowledge of antiquity that was making its way back into the West, particularly after the fall of Constantinople in 1452, 4, something like that.
3, I think.
3, yeah, I've bracketed it. And all these scholars come to the West, and all of a sudden people are going, hey, this Aristotle guy is pretty cool. And so people like Aquinas are trying to take our Platonic based theology and incorporate this new learning that's coming in from the West. So if you look at Aquinas's Summa Theologica, it's really a big project to kind of, okay, we've got some more knowledge, let's see how this all fits in. Again, that's a big, glib summary, but that's part of what's going on there. So at the very beginning, so that kind of brackets where we are today. If we look at the early Middle Ages, one of the things that's characteristic of it is this rise in monasticism. It had been operating in the East, in the desert, but it starts to take over Western practices as well. We have Saint Benedict around 480, born around that time. So around the beginning of the 6th century, we get the Benedictine kind of orders. They start to put together rules and kind of, the procedures for how you run these kinds of societies. And depending on where this was, a lot of these were also motivated by tax kind of incentives, because people, I can't afford, all those taxes, and I'm spending all my time working for the king. I'm going to go live in a monastery. They don't have to pay taxes. That's one of the motivations behind that. So just so you know that, the more things change. And we have the beginnings of what you would call Christendom. So in the East, the Orthodox Church is wedded to the emperor in Constantinople, but we start to see that to happen in a more broader fashion, a more specific linkage of the Catholic Church with the powers in the West. And this eventually, starts to bring us to the Carolingian Empire, when you have Charles the Great, sees it as he gets himself crowned as the Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in Rome, as a sign that I'm the new Caesar kind of optics. So meanwhile, Christendom at this point, from the West, it's Catholic France, it's the parts of Germany that aren't Saxon and pagan, it's the British Isles, and it's Spain, and it's North Africa. And that seems odd to us. For example, Augustine is in North Africa. It's very much Greek and Roman in culture at the time. This is prior to Islam. But even at this time, in the early part of the Middle Ages, Christendom in the West is smaller than Christendom in the East. It's still, Rome becomes like, the Pittsburgh of the ancient world. It used to be a big deal, and now it's kind of on more rough times. And, places like Alexandria and Constantinople, and eventually Baghdad with the rise of Islam, are much more prosperous and learned places. I'm going to skip a bit. It's about this time that the Eastern Church starts to move even further to the east. They found a stele, kind of a stone marker that dates from about the 7th, 8th century in China. From Syria to Cathay was one of the markers on it, so they know that Christians had gone as far as China early on. We talked about the St. Thomas Christians in India, and they were replenished with a lot of migration by Eastern Christians towards the east as the Persians began to repress them, and as the Mongols eventually came in, that pushed more of them towards the east. So what happens around 570 CE? Anybody know?
Is that when they split?
Nope.
Yeah.
We're running up to that though. Muhammad is born. And this starts the caliphate, which is the government and the religion, the head of religion, all residing in one person, kind of like, King Charles technically is the head of the church and the head of the government, but he's actually neither. But in this case, he was, Muhammad was. And, to put a context on Islam, it's extreme monotheism. So they would look at the Trinity and say, this is idolatry. This is all made up. So we're going to have one God and keep it simple. And he's got a prophet, and that prophet's the root. So their governance is pretty straightforward. There's one God, there's one prophet, and that prophet is the ruler. And that's how this starts. And it takes off, of course, like wildfire, maybe even literally, all the way to Spain. And then they have their own civil war. And the Umayyad dynasty is overthrown, except in one place. And that one place is Spain. And a lot of us, I know, have been to Cordoba, which becomes the capital of Islamic Spain. And they engage in, kind of direct, even though they're kind of on two different sides of that civil war, there's a lot of discourse between Baghdad, Damascus, and the capitals in the east, and Cordoba. And so Spain becomes a bit of a repository of this Eastern knowledge that was preserved in Islamic East because of Syrian Christians. So they started having libraries, and I wouldn't say universities, but proto centers of learning. And they were basically run by Nestorian Christians, by Syrian Christians. And so that was the mechanism by which this ancient knowledge was kind of preserved and then inculcated into the Islamic culture.
When did that happen in the Renaissance with the libraries? Was that about the same time, or was after that the rich started getting these manuscripts, these old, and having libraries that people could go into?
So the Greeks, of course, had these immense libraries. Yeah, the Library of Alexandria, which I'm still pissed about, by the way, but was frittered away and then finally destroyed. The fact that the myth is Christians ran in and burned everything, which isn't really. We probably had a hand in that, but it wasn't just us. And a lot of these moved into the east, and were the caretakers were still in the monastic kind of an academic environment that existed in the Byzantine East. First university is in Constantinople, but we're still a few hundred years away from that. But Cordoba, for example, in the model of the East, starts to build out libraries and repositories as well. There's a great line. Yes, sir.
Why did Christians burn the library at Alexandria?
It was more of a political kind of faction thing. In the library, it had already been kind of frittered away because it lost its patronage from the Ptolemies, and then the later Roman patronage. So, if you don't have money, it starts to fritter away. And then eventually, Alexandria, because it was so cosmopolitan, had all these different factions, and it was a very violent place. because people were passionate about what they believed and they were always at each other's throats about it. So it was caught up, and this wasn't even one destruction. There were different points at which the library or branch libraries were.
Well, it was one of the greatest libraries in the history of the world, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's why I'm still pissed about it, because we've lost so much. And that's one of the interesting things about this new technology that they're using to get the charred scrolls out of Pompeii, is they think they might be able to recover actually a lot of the stories that we don't know that were, you know, more broadly in circulation at the time.
There are two books, if anybody wants to read, about bringing back the knowledge of the old lost books or scrolls. There's a book called The Swerve,
Mhm.
that if you can get through the first 100 pages, is fascinating. It's a history of how that came to be.
Yeah.
And there's another one that's called The Bookseller of Florence. And it talks about these manuscripts, these book hunters going off to the rundown monasteries and pulling back a lot of the ancient texts.
So by about the middle of the 8th century, Baghdad had this great library they called the House of Wisdom, and it was run by Syrian Christians. And there was, as I mentioned, a lot of discourse into Cordoba, and you can trace a lot of the music and art and all that and literature, so we could see that that was, despite them being very far away from ancient standards, a very tight relationship. It's a great line from Lawrence of Arabia, if you guys remember that movie, or Prince Faisal, you know, is talking to Lawrence, and he goes, you know, you Englishmen love the desert, whereas we Arabs dream of the lost gardens of Cordoba. So in the Arabic imagination, you know, that was their kind of golden age. That's what they recall as being their high water mark. And as we noted, the Arabs practiced tahimi, which is this tolerance for people of the book. So they considered Jews and Christians as a group that had received legitimate divine inspiration. So we'll let you practice your faith, but you're not going to have the same advantages as the Muslims, so you're going to have to pay an extra tax. And you have to agree to serve the city. You're going to be in the armed forces with us. You're going to participate in the government. You're not going to be a separate sect. You're going to integrate with us. And you know, that system went on pretty happily for 1,000 years in the Ottoman Empire and in the Emirate of Spain, the various Emiratis of Spain. Trying to do a little bit of editing here. So this went in Spain all the way, of course, to the fall of Granada in 1492, where it's interesting that the new kings and queen of Spain, you know, walked up the steps of the Alhambra in Arabic dress, and then they promised that they would continue the practice of tahimi so that everybody could still practice what their religion was. And as soon as they got the keys, Ferdinand asked the Pope for an inquisition. They made their decree expelling all the Jews and Muslims that wouldn't convert, and then they put an inquisition together to keep an eye on those Jews and those Muslims that converted to make sure it was legitimate. The Pope, I think it was Sylvester, I may have that wrong, I can't remember, but the Pope at the time said, this is getting out of hand, let's stop this. And it was Ferdinand that said, nope, this is useful to me, let's keep this going. So the church gets criticized for, the excesses of the, my brain just cramped, of the Inquisition, yeah, sorry. But it was actually, continued because of its political value in the conquest and assimilation of Spain. So we see again the danger of when you get government and religion together, it gets twisted. One of the reasons that this that Spain the Muslim Spain got reduced was there were fundamentalists in the Maghreb in North Africa, Islamic fundamentalists, who were looking at what was happening in Spain and they couldn't stand it. It's watering down Islam. At the same time, you had more extreme Catholic voices looking at Spain going, we can't have this because we're the exclusive truth. So what you had really was this golden era, which was reduced by people who couldn't stand it over centuries. So that's why we can't have nice things.
Mike, when you say golden era, you're talking about this 1,000-year period of time where under Muslim rule, there was an understanding that Jews and Christians and Muslims could live together side by side with a different belief structure, honoring each other peaceably.
Correct.
That's what you mean.
Correct.
Yeah. So it's been done before.
Yeah. Well, by our standards, it would not be very tolerant, but by the standards of the day, it was quite tolerant. Yeah.
Something we skipped over in time there with the time of the Crusades.
Yeah.
Which was 1100 or something like
Yeah.
that, until 100 years or whatever. And that was definitely not a time of tolerance.
No.
They
That-
riled people up.
And that's where we are next.
Right. He's getting there.
Yeah. But I want to mention just a minute Orthodox Christianity. This is when we started to have a few schisms from the Orthodox side based on, continuing discussions about the nature of Christ. They're still arguing about that, and they're still arguing about icons. And in a sense, we're still arguing about icons. Some people want the primary expression of Christianity and theological thinking to be verbal. It's intellectual, it's abstract. Others have argued that its expression in the religious imagination, for example, through the arts, through music, through painting, iconography, architecture, is an equal and valid mode of us understanding what Christianity is. And that debate still goes on, and it was reignited a little bit, or quite a bit, in the Reformation, and we'll talk about that a little bit next week. But this is kind of rocking the Eastern Church. They're still having wars about this, about the nature of Christ, and should we have icons or not, those kinds of things. So about the same time that Islam is spreading out, we have the rise, as I noted, of the Carolingian Empire. And one of the things they're doing is conquering the Saxons. They're very busy doing that. And the next thing they need to do is convert them. So how do they convert them? They force baptize them and they enforce church attendance. That didn't really work very well. So then they decided what these people need is Christianity expressed in their own culture. So Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son, commissioned something called the Highland. Has anyone ever heard of this? They took all four Gospels, they reduced it to one Gospel, and they rewrote it as if it were a Saxon epic poem. And it is a cool read. I mean, it's like Lord of the Rings meets the Gospel. Jesus is this, warrior king, and his apostles are loyal thanes, and they meet in mead halls. And when you, an interesting about it is also the Carolingians managed to kind of, adapt this into something that was useful to them. For example, if, where they asked Jesus, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus answers in the Gospels we know, yeah, pay, give to Caesar what's Caesar and give to God what's his God's. In the Highland, it says, yes, you should pay your taxes and you should do it gladly and you shouldn't forget. It kind of skips the other part.
Don't cheat.
Yeah, but you can download it for free. There's several translations, but it's a hoot to read. Read the Lord's Prayer in ancient Saxon. It's pretty fun too.
How do you spell that?
It's got different spellings, but Heliand will get you there. It's actually Heiland, which has got the little funny accent on top of the H. All right, so then the Eastern and Western Church align on one thing. We should have some crusades. So we need to get the Muslims out of Jerusalem. So when you need something done in Western Europe at the time, you call the Franks, because they're the badasses that can, they've been, conquering. They and the Normans are kind of the superpowers of that time. So the Franks, run into, lead the First Crusade, takes over. We get the Crusader states in the Levant. Before they do that, though, there's these kind of proto-Protestants in the south of France. We can't really have a crusade without dealing with our own problems first. So they go have an internal crusade to purge the Albigensians. And there's another sect, I can't remember what it is offhand, but, we're going to go get them, for no good reason. But first we're going to get us, and then we're going to go get them. And then as we all know, the Muslims push back, and there's several crusades that kind of end up back where we started. One thing that happens, though, is this engagement with this ancient knowledge starts to make its way back to Europe through the engagement with the Muslims. The other thing that happens is the Fourth Crusade. Does anyone know what happened in the Fourth Crusade? Super interesting.
600 Rebecca. Oh, no, that's not the.
Yeah. So,
And they play just as I am.
yeah.
Is that right?
The Masons started? No.
It's even weirder. So the Venetians and the French are going to go on the Fourth Crusade. So the Venetians say, we'll build the boats. You guys bring the mounted knights, and we'll do well. So the French told them about how many boats to build. They arrive a year later with about half the number, but they've built all the boats. And the Venetians say, we're not going until you pay me for all the boats. Well, we don't need all the boats, but I built all the boats. Then two guys show up. One of them is the pretender to the throne of Constantinople. Said, hey, if you guys will install me as the emperor, I'll give you the rest of the money, and then you guys can go on to the Fourth Crusade. Well, as you can imagine, they got to Constantinople, they sacked it, because the guys stiffed them. And they took all this amazing, almost 2,000 years of stuff, relics, treasures, all this stuff. They had it in their boats. We don't need to go to we don't have to do the rest of the crusade. We did pretty good. They say every major church in Europe had relics that were plundered from Constantinople. It wasn't until like the 90s where the Catholic Church actually gave the relics of St. John Chrysostom back to the Orthodox. They'd held on to them. So this weakened, as you can imagine, the Byzantines or the Romans, and then within 100 years or so, they were overrun by the Muslims who had gunpowder, by the Turks. Yes, sir.
What was maybe there wasn't any, but what was the philosophical justification for the Crusades in view of the doctrine of Jesus, which are the teachings of Jesus, which said, love your neighbor and, don't judge, and the whole idea of going and killing people if they don't adopt Christianity, to me, I've always struggled with that.
I know.
How did they rationalize that?
It's almost like you need a Reformation. Sorry.
I do.
Yeah, no, it's like the church needed a Reformation.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry to be
Yeah.
puckish with that response, but it was, as we noted, it was church and state were so linked that the interests became the same.
Well,
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Pope Urban gave us a famous speech telling the people in the church that they would receive, instead of doing penance and different things like that,
Yeah.
they would receive forgiveness of their sins for fighting against the infidel.
Yeah,
And that persuaded a whole bunch. He was expecting to get a little response. He got a great response. And the first people to go were the peasants, and they had the peasant
yeah.
crusade, and those guys got slaughtered.
Yeah.
Terrible. Then they got the knights to go.
Yeah,
I think we shouldn't be calling it the church here.
Yeah.
We should call it what it is, about a bunch of a lineage of rich, powerful males. We talk about it as something God did. God didn't do it. The history, the litany that you're giving us is history of humankind.
right.
Right.
It's just
Well,
shows.
but it was through the auspices of the church. That's what it was. I mean,
Their religio-political complex.
Exactly. You cannot give our religion, our church, a pass on becoming corrupted, leaving behind a teaching that was, when Jesus says to Peter, put away your sword, he said that to all of us.
Yeah,
And we put that away to get power, 300 years after Jesus said it, and we haven't put that sword down yet.
No.
And that's on us.
yeah.
That's what-
I just don't wanna give there was this little thing called the church that
But Jesus.
those powerful people were in the church and saw the church as a means to not only have power, but to expand power.
I don't think Jesus created a church.
He did, he said he did. The whole concept of having apostles, and those apostles were to do things, and those things were to grow the kingdom, that's
But I
all
don't think
Jesus
he
said.
meant it the way the apostles interpreted it. He may have said it, but I'm not sure the followers, it quickly got twisted by followers.
What was a movement became an institution,
Yeah.
which is a consistent pattern in human history.
Yeah.
And the essence of the movement is somewhere under there, but institutions will do anything to protect themselves. And that's what's going on. That's what's
And we'll really dive into this topic when we get, not next week, but the following week, when we get into the radical Reformation and the Free Church, because that's exactly the point that they're after.
Well, another example of this, the Inquisition, they would stretch people on the racks until they finally, because of the pain and desperation, would confess Jesus. And then they would kill them because their soul was secure now.
Yeah,
And, the rationale behind that is primitive and bizarre. How Christians got to that point is just, I would have been on the rack for sure, and I can identify
What's the difference between that and saying, well, you're gonna go to heaven, so we'll take your Medicare, your healthcare away?
Yeah,
Yeah, well,
exactly.
There you go.
It is.
Don't earn.
It is our nature. So I'm going to mention a couple of things before I run out of time because I think they're big deals. Around the year 1988, supposedly, we have the conversion of the Slavs. So the Eastern Church, lands in an ark. The Prince of Kiev, decides that his realm is going to be Orthodox Christian. And that really grows in the Slavic lands. The Mongols come in and they're just real jerks, vicious guys. And so they all kind of move into Russia and spread out. And that's why the Russians would see themselves as the remnant that's holding on to what the real church is. So, the Russian church, Eastern Orthodox Church, sees itself as the original church, and it's preserved, and particularly in the Russian Patriarch. And about this time, we have the Great Schism, which we say happened in 1054, but it was really happening hundreds of years before and continued afterwards. It was the last straw, and it was a political thing more than it was a theological thing. The political environment said there was no way they were going to be able to resolve this theological issue. So there were a big flurry of excommunications. And now let's leave on some good news. Things that the Middle Age Christianity gave us. Cathedrals. There's some discussion about that, but let's talk about hospitals. The Crusaders ran into these, very, very advanced medicine in the East. They brought that back and started to develop hospitals. In fact, there were orders like the Knights of St. John or the Knights Hospitaliers that were founded all these hospitals. And they eventually became universities to a large degree, particularly in Italy. The first university was in 849, and they were very ecclesiastical. But soon after, you had the founding of Cambridge, the University of Padua, Rome, Florence, Prague, Vienna, Heidelberg. And this, they had always, to various degrees, been places where free inquiry was allowed, even though they were ecclesiastical, because that was seen as an important way to speak ex gymnasia, to speak from the schoolhouse, to speculate, and to try out ideas. So that was kind of the first safe space that was given for people to have these discussions. Now the church would speak ex cathedra, which is, okay, we've heard all that, but this is what orthodoxy is. But speculation was still allowed. And it's about this time as well when all these scholars and knowledge from the East come into the West. This is a place where we're trying to absorb all this and reconcile it, incorporate it into the theology and philosophy and worldviews that had been existing since the fall of Western Rome. So it's important to note that in the West, we see the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages as a place where there's a reduction in knowledge and then a recovery of it. But that never really went away in the East. It was, really the political environment and the economic environment that caused that to happen. And it's probably not to the degree that we're prone to think of it as that way. We also had these things called plagues, and that was problematic because they needed someone to blame the plagues on. So who did they blame? Who did they blame? Jews. And that came back, of course, to bite Europe, because they could never really shake the whole idea that the other would live among them. They weren't as comfortable as the Ottomans or earlier the Spanish Muslims were, and allowing that to happen. I will probably hit the pause button there. Next week, we'll look at the Reformation, the Catholic Church, and the Eastern Church, kind of moving in a broad front up to the present day. And then week after next, I want to step back and just look at the Radical Reformation, the Free Church tradition, backing up even before the Reformation, and move forward kind of into our tradition. So that's my evil plan. Right, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Before you can
Are you including the Reformation next week?
Yes, ma'am.